Hi, this is Jim Huling, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Execution Insights, the podcast. Now, if you and I were sitting across from each other right now, maybe with a warm cup of coffee in our hands and just having a conversation, I think I would begin this episode exactly the way I'm beginning it now, with something simple, something human, something you have felt many times in your own leadership. And it's simply this: there are moments when a leader walks into the room and without saying anything, the whole atmosphere changes. Have you seen it? Have you experienced that? You know, people in that moment look up and the room gets a little quieter. There's a small, almost invisible shift that everyone senses, but nobody tries to put a name to because it's subtle, but it's also real. And right now, I think that kind of presence matters more than maybe it ever has before. Because the truth is, people are carrying a lot these days, especially leaders. The pressure of performance, the pace, which is unrelenting, and all the uncertainty that fills our world in these days. These things are trying to get us to handle things quietly and privately while still showing up to do our best. And it's really hard. And sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can bring into a room is not a brilliant plan or a big rousing speech. It's simply the steadiness of who they are. In fact, I would submit to you that that quiet presence can change everything. Now, when we talk about presence, I want to be careful because I think presence gets really misunderstood, frankly, almost all the time. And a lot of people think presence is about charisma, or confidence or polish. And there are some people who even believe it's about whether you cross your arms or not, or whether you make eye contact or put your hands on your hips. And I suppose all those things are part of the formula for presence, but they're not where presence begins. Presence begins on the inside. Presence is the inner steadiness that you and I carry into the room, frankly, long before we ever say a word. And it's in reality the kind of clarity we've already chosen, or you might say the kind of conviction that we're rooted in before the meeting ever begins. I believe people don't respond to how impressive you look, obviously. I believe people respond to what you and I carry. Because presence is not a performance. Presence is brought as a gift. And to illustrate that, I want to share something from my own leadership journey. And it's not a story that I tell often. And it's not one, by the way, that makes me look good. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But I think it's one of those moments that changed how I think about presence all the way to this day. I've never forgotten it. So early in my leadership career, there was a day when I walked into a meeting, frankly, carrying more pressure than even I realized. Now, in the meeting, nothing dramatic happened. It wasn't one of those moments that you're glad wasn't being videoed. Nobody yelled and no one was shouting, and I didn't say anything that I needed to take back. But I was tight. In fact, I was wound too tight. And I was so focused on the outcome rather than the people that I wasn't myself. Now, after the meeting, one of the people I trusted most in the world knocked on my door and he said, "Hey, Jim, I don't think you noticed it, but the way you walked into that room today really made everybody pretty anxious. In fact, in that moment, we stopped thinking about the work. We started thinking about you and how tense you were." Now, that was a painful truth to hear, but for me as a leader, it was a really important one. I hadn't said a thing, but I had brought something into the room with me, if you understand the way I'm speaking. And it was something heavy. In fact, it was something unsteady, because I was unsteady. And from that moment on, I made it a point to be so much more aware of what I was carrying in terms of my presence. Now, fast forward more than a decade later, I was CEO of a really wonderful company, and in a challenging time of the economic world and the life that I was living. But there was a moment in that chapter that literally shaped my understanding of this even more. A really sudden downturn had forced the market into one of the hardest responsibilities a leader can ever face. I had to restructure the company, and real people were going to be affected, people that I cared about, people that I had worked with, people that had given so much to the mission and the goals that we were trying to achieve. And I just want to tell you, the weight of that moment was enormous. And when the day came to address everyone, I remember walking to the auditorium all by myself and literally trying to decide what kind of leader I needed to be when I stepped up on that platform. Should I walk in with confidence and bravado, or should I reassure everyone that everything was under control? But I have to say, thank goodness, something shifted in me as I walked down that hallway. I realized that pretending to be unshakable not only wouldn't help anyone, it was not what the moment required. And it certainly was not what these good people deserved. So when I stepped up onto that stage, I didn't try to be inspiring. I didn't try to be impressive. I just tried to be true. I told them that the road ahead was going to be really difficult and that we were going to feel it both professionally and personally. But I also told them with every ounce of belief I had that we would walk through it together and that we would come out the other side. Now, in that moment, I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel heroic. What I felt was responsible for telling the truth, responsible for staying committed, responsible for not abandoning these good people and the weight we all carried in that moment. And looking back now, as the company not only recovered, thank goodness, but went on to set new records and new levels of performance even higher, I sometimes wonder if the actual turning point wasn't that specific moment in that room. Not because of anything brilliant I said, because I wasn't brilliant at all, but because I chose to bring honesty and steadiness instead of performance. Now, ever since then, I've stopped thinking about presence as a skill. It's not something that you master the way you might an athletic skill or learning another language. No, presence is something that you cultivate and you have to reinforce. It's frankly a way of being. And leaders with presence don't rush. You can feel it, they're never trying to outrun their own anxiety. They move at the speed of calm. And they also don't inflate themselves. They're not trying to dominate the room or prove anything to anybody or give a grand performance. They carry a quiet confidence that comes from conviction, and they are present with the people. And when I say that, I mean really present. When someone speaks to them, they aren't half listening in order to prepare their perfect response. They're not scanning the room looking for the next person they want to talk to. They are right there responding to the person that is in front of them. And you know what else I've learned is that presence is quiet. Presence may be one of the most important leadership qualities we actually have, not because it solves our problems, but because it changes the way people face those problems. In fact, a leader with presence actually lowers the temperature. If you've ever watched this happen, people literally start to breathe easier. And when they breathe easier, they think more clearly and they settle into the finding of a solution. I think presence tells the whole team, even without words, we are going to face this together and we are going to come through it. Now, that moment got particularly important to me when I was coaching years later another senior executive. In fact, this is a leader I coached not long ago from making this actual recording. And he was a leader who struggled with presence. Now, it wasn't because he lacked talent. He had plenty of talent, but it was because he walked into every room literally at a sprint. His energy was way out ahead of him. It almost entered the room before he did. And every meeting started with tension instead of possibilities. And one day, as his coach, he said to me, Jim, I just don't know how to slow myself down. And I want to tell you, I think he half thought that was an attribute. But I told him this thing I'm sharing with you today, something I had really learned the hard way. Presence doesn't come from moving slowly, it comes from being settled on the inside. It's an inner state that affects our outer presence. So I encouraged him before the next meeting to take time to breathe, to ask himself, what is the leader these good people need from me this time? And he's been practicing that for months. And the reports from his team is just wonderful that his whole presence has changed. It's changed his leadership. It's changed the way he walks into a room. It's changed the way he interacts with every single person who follows him. So let's talk about ways that you can strengthen your presence. And the first one I've already said, slow down, sort of arrive before you arrive. Because when you walk into that meeting, you have an effect that may be very different than what you actually realize it is. So take a few seconds, come back to yourself before you went in. Second, decide which version of you needs to be in the room. Sometimes we need to be calm and clear and honest and hopeful. Sometimes we need to be high energy, and we need to be confident and charismatic even when it's called for. But I'm only saying choose that style or presence intentionally. And last, notice what you're carrying emotionally. If you walk into the room unsettled, within a few seconds, the entire room will be, frankly, unsettled. So you have to ask yourself the questions that have anchored so many leaders if you really want to do this well. And there are only two of them. The first one is, am I committed to walking through this with the team? Now, if the answer to that is yes, I promise your presence will already be felt. But as you move through this week, think about the second question. Am I fully committed to see it through? You see, the weight of your presence is not measured by how strong you look when you're standing there. Not at all, right? It's measured by the steadiness you bring. So hold on to these few things. Presence is quiet. Presence is grounded. Presence is honest. Presence is human. And more than anything else, your presence is a gift that you bring into the room long before you speak, and it's one that your team and every team needs more than you could ever imagine, especially in times like these. So thank you for spending this time with me today, and I hope this conversation gives you something meaningful to carry into your leadership next week as you begin to focus on the presence that you bring to every single interaction, to every decision, and to every moment that define your leadership. When you do this, I promise you, you'll begin to see the results reflected in the people you lead and ultimately in your results. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Jim Huling, and this is Execution Insights. I'll see you on the next episode.